Dawn broke over the Pacific on June 1944, pale light cutting through the mist that clung to the rolling waves. A solitary submarine breached the surface, its silhouette etched against the horizon, silent yet purposeful. Within hours, it would alter the calculus of war in ways the Japanese command had deemed impossible. 33 ships destroyed in 9 months, a figure that staggered even the most hardened naval analysts, defied every assumption about patrols, convoy defenses, and the ocean's vastness. At the helm was Commander Richard O'Kane, a man whose calm bordered on unsettling. He moved with deliberate precision, issuing orders in a voice that betrayed no hesitation, no doubt. His crew followed, a single organism bound by training, discipline, and an unspoken understanding of the stakes. Where others saw risk, O'Kane saw opportunity, and in the confined steel corridors of his submarine, he shaped chaos into strategy. The Pacific in mid-1944 was a theater of overwhelming complexity. Convoys threaded through thousands of miles, escorting merchant ships under the constant threat of air raids, naval mines, and patrols that spanned day and night. American losses mounted steadily, yet so too did the audacity of those willing to challenge the vast Japanese network. Every hour brought new data, new danger, and new chance for decisive action. Japanese confidence ran deep. Their layered defenses, from sonar-equipped escorts to vigilant air patrols, created the illusion of invincibility. Strategists believed that any submarine venturing into these waters would be detected and destroyed long before it could inflict serious damage. The ocean itself seemed to conspire with them, masking the movements of convoys while revealing every shadow of approaching danger. Yet the USS Tang operated under a doctrine entirely foreign to conventional tactics. Point-blank attacks, rapid surface strikes, and unorthodox torpedo patterns redefined the boundaries of submarine warfare. Every engagement was a controlled gamble, a test of nerve and timing executed in silence and under immense pressure. Where others hesitated, the Tang struck with cold precision. Its patrols left Japanese convoys in disarray, their defenses pierced in ways they could not anticipate. By the end of 9 months, the tally of destruction was staggering. It was not brute force alone, but a synthesis of innovation, discipline, and the quiet confidence of a commander who understood the ocean as both battlefield and ally. This is the story of the most destructive submarine patrol in naval history. And yet, as the mist lifted over the Pacific, no one on either side could foresee the escalation that these early victories would soon provoke. On paper, the USS Tang had no right to survive. Outnumbered by Japanese convoys, outgunned by destroyers bristling with depth charges, and navigating waters laced with traps and mines, the patrol defied every conventional assessment. Charts and statistics painted a grim picture. Each mile forward was a risk multiplied by the enemy's technological edge. Yet forward they went, the submarine slicing through the Pacific with quiet, resolute purpose. The Japanese had deployed their most sophisticated defenses. Convoy density created corridors of almost unbearable danger, sonar-equipped escorts prowled beneath the waves, and coordinated air patrols made the ocean a constant arena of detection. Every vessel, every shadow could signal imminent destruction. For the Tang, each approach demanded precision measured against uncertainty, the margin for error vanishing with every passing second. Compounding these dangers were the ghosts of the U.S. Navy's early war torpedo failures. Torpedoes had struck without detonating, targets had slipped away, and entire patrols had returned empty-handed, haunted by what should have succeeded. The crew carried this memory like a silent burden, aware that even flawless execution could falter against the imperfect tools at their disposal. Beneath the surface, the psychological strain was relentless. Submerged hours bled into one another, the air thick with rising carbon dioxide. Breaths grew shallow, minds sharpened by tension, and yet every man remained vigilant. The submarine was a machine of iron and discipline, each compartment humming with silent, practiced efficiency, every creak of steel accounted for, every motion calibrated. The men themselves were young, ordinary in every measurable way. Yet in this claustrophobic vessel, they performed extraordinary feats. Training, intuition, and sheer endurance merged into a singular force capable of bending circumstance. Ordinary hands launched torpedoes that would rewrite expectations. Ordinary eyes scanned the horizon with an awareness that bordered on instinct. And still the question lingered, almost unspoken among the crew. How could a single submarine overturn an entire theater of expectation? In the darkness of the Pacific, with the enemy confined, and the odds insurmountable. The answer lay in a combination of precision, audacity, and the quiet resolve of men willing to trust one another beyond reason. Every calculated risk, every torpedo fired in silence, carried the weight of consequence. And yet, as the Tang slipped through the convoys undetected, another layer of the ocean's theater waited just beyond the horizon, one that would test the limits of courage and innovation in ways no one aboard could yet imagine. The USS Tang was commissioned in 1943, emerging from the yards of Portsmouth Navy Shipyard as more than steel and rivets. She embodied a new vision of submarine warfare, one shaped by necessity, innovation, and the hard lessons of the Pacific. Her bow was sharper, her engines more reliable, her hull a sleeker promise of speed and stealth. Sensors and radar pushed the boundaries of detection, allowing her to glide through the ocean with a quiet prescience that older vessels could only envy. Commander Richard O'Kane had arrived with a philosophy forged in experience and tempered by losses. He believed in striking first, in closing with the enemy until there was no time to react, no chance to recover. Hesitation, he had learned aboard the USS Wahoo, could be fatal. There, under the relentless sun of the Pacific, he had discovered the razor's edge between prudence and paralysis, and he carried that lesson into every patrol aboard the Tang. The Pacific itself had proven a harsh teacher. Early American submarines had faltered against Japanese technology and doctrine. Torpedoes failed to detonate. Convoys eluded detection. Men returned to port empty-handed, their confidence eroded by circumstance. It was within this crucible of frustration and failure that the Tang's doctrine was forged. Audacity, precision, and the willingness to embrace calculated risk where others would cling to safety. Crew training mirrored the vessel's philosophy. Stress drills simulated depth charges pounding against the hull, engines failing, compartments flooded. Blind approaches forced men to rely on instinct and timing rather than instruments alone. Pressure chambers acclimated them to suffocating depths, to the rising carbon dioxide that would greet them during extended submergence. Each exercise honed not just skill, but the mental resilience necessary to operate within steel walls that could become a tomb with a single miscalculation. And yet, for all its sophistication, the Tang was a paradox, designed to hunt, not to survive. Every feature, every protocol emphasized offense over defense. Survival would be an accident, a byproduct of skill and audacity rather than the vessel's construction. Within her quiet, steel belly, a young crew trained to dance along the edge of death, their ordinary humanity intersecting with extraordinary technology. In every knot of tension, in every calculated maneuver, the unspoken truth lingered. The Tang was not meant to retreat. She was meant to strike, to dominate, and to redefine what a submarine could accomplish. And as her engines hummed beneath the Pacific surface, the theater of war braced unknowingly for the hunter about to emerge. Japan's survival depended on a network of lifelines stretching across the vast Pacific. Tankers, troopships, and supply convoys moved like arteries of empire, linking home islands to distant garrisons in the Philippines, New Guinea, and the Solomons. Each ship carried not only fuel and munitions, but the fragile hopes of commanders far from the capital. Disruption of this network was, in theory, unthinkable. The war could not endure if the convoys faltered. In response to devastating early losses at the hands of American submarines, the Japanese Navy had adopted a doctrine of tight formations and heavy escort. Convoys traveled in compact columns, each vessel shielded by destroyers bristling with sonar, depth charges, and long-range guns. The escorts patrolled the flanks and rear, a mobile wall of steel and vigilance. From above, reconnaissance aircraft scanned for any irregularity. From below, sonar operators listened for the faintest whisper of a torpedo tube. Improvements in sonar technology and depth charge deployment had created a sense of technological invincibility. Japanese engineers had refined hydrophone sensitivity, enhanced explosive depth precision, and trained crews to detect, classify, and destroy submarines before they could strike. Every convoy's passage became a carefully choreographed ballet, a display of discipline and order that commanders trusted would keep the ocean itself at bay. Confidence ran deep, entwined with cultural conviction. Where Americans relied on improvisation and audacity, Japanese doctrine valued precision and consistency. A disciplined escort force, they believed, could absorb any attack, suppress any threat, and maintain the rhythm of supply. Submarine warfare was anticipated, calculated for, and in theory neutralized before it could yield strategic effect. Yet there was a hidden flaw. The very rigidity that created control also imposed predictability. Routes repeated, timing became habitual, and the pattern of movement allowed those who watched to anticipate, even exploit, the system. Every meticulously plotted convoy left traces in the water, echoes of human behavior that could be read by a patient, disciplined adversary. Japanese command assumed that no single submarine, no matter how bold, could disrupt the flow of war. Convoy defense was not merely tactical. It was strategic psychology, a statement of confidence in systems, discipline, and cultural order. Within this fortress-like network, they felt insulated, impervious to the daring individual maneuvers that had frustrated them in the past. But the Pacific, vast and deceptive, rarely honored assumptions. A lone submarine with audacity calibrated by intelligence could exploit the very predictability that inspired confidence. And so, beneath the calm surface of Japanese planning, a vulnerability awaited, invisible to those who believed their convoy walls unbreakable. February 1944 marked the beginning of the USS Tang's first patrol, a crucible in which Commander Richard O'Kane's aggressive doctrine would be tested against the unforgiving expanse of the Pacific. The submarine slipped through the pre-dawn haze, engines humming, periscopes slicing the surface. This was not a routine patrol. Every decision carried the weight of doctrine, every maneuver the potential to redefine what a submarine could accomplish. It began with a radar contact late one night, a faint echo on the scopes that hinted at movement beyond the darkness. Convoy lights glimmered distantly, a scattered pattern of merchantmen and their escorts. O'Kane made his decision swiftly, to close the distance, to attack at point-blank range, and to strike before the enemy could react. The order shocked the men aboard. Conventional wisdom demanded caution, yet here was a commander choosing audacity. The crew held their breath as the Tang drew nearer. Depth gauges rattled, sonar pings echoed faintly against the hull, and the night air above the Pacific lay thick with anticipation. Torpedoes were loaded, calculations double-checked, and every crewman assumed his position with meticulous discipline. Then, in rapid succession, the first torpedo was fired, a violent arc of steel guided by intent and practice, striking with uncanny precision. One by one, targets succumbed. Merchant ships shuddered, convoys erupted in flames, and within moments, several vessels were gone beneath the waves. The effect on the Japanese escorts was immediate and profound. Shock replaced confidence. Protocols hesitated in the face of tactics they had been taught to anticipate but could not comprehend. Their screens, once impenetrable, now appeared porous and vulnerable. The suddenness of the assault, combined with the Tang's willingness to close the distance rather than maintain standoff, disrupted not only formations but expectations of command. Below decks, a subtle transformation took hold among the American crew. The terror and tension that had characterized early engagements gave way to a resolute belief in their commander's vision. O'Kane was no longer merely a captain. He was a pioneer, redefining the rules of engagement in real time. Every maneuver, every torpedo strike became a lesson in audacity and precision, a recalibration of what a submarine could accomplish when men trusted one another implicitly. Official reports would later struggle to reconcile the tally of destroyed ships. The numbers seemed impossible, too high, too rapid, too complete. Yet there it was, indelibly recorded. A new standard of warfare emerging from the steel hull. Their preparation fused marksmanship with independent action and the principles of amphibious assault. Squads moved like living instruments, each rifle, machine gun, and automatic weapon an extension of the unit's intent. Leaders at the lowest levels, the non-commissioned officers, were not merely transmitters of orders but combat architects in miniature, capable of orchestrating movement and fire under the most chaotic conditions. In every engagement, a platoon could fragment into small, autonomous teams without losing cohesion, their initiative supported by doctrine rather than hindered by hierarchy. It was a philosophy rooted in the conviction that every Marine, regardless of rank, was a rifleman first, a principle that produced extraordinary consistency and reliability on the battlefield. Japanese officers, accustomed to Western troops whose nerves frayed under sustained fire, found themselves confounded. These Americans moved calmly beneath the rain of artillery and mortar, returning fire with measured precision, coordinating suppressive barrages while advancing steadily. Where the Empire had assumed fear and hesitate. On would dictate the tempo of battle, the Marines imposed their own rhythm. Each assault became an exercise in controlled violence, each defense a calculated demonstration of endurance. The psychological impact of such composure was profound, shaking assumptions built over years of prior encounters. Coordination extended beyond the infantry line. Naval guns, once instruments of distant bombardment, were integrated into the advance with seamless precision. Spotters relayed corrections from forward teams, and shells fell with uncanny timing, shaping the battlefield in favor of the assaulting Marines. The combination of land and sea firepower created an operational reach that left Japanese defenders struggling to respond. Artillery became not only a support tool, but an extension of the Marine ethos itself, flexible, accurate, and inexorably advancing alongside the infantry. As the hours and days passed, the Empire was forced to confront a harsh truth. Their assumptions about the American character, the perception of weakness, individualism, and hesitation, were profoundly flawed. These Marines were disciplined, adaptable, and fearless in ways that textbooks could not predict. Every advance, every defensive stand, challenged the doctrines that had guided the Empire for decades. In the quiet aftermath of each engagement, officers began to whisper an acknowledgement long avoided. This was not an enemy to be measured by prior experience, but a force crafted for victory under conditions that had once been thought unassailable. And yet the islands held more secrets. Beyond the next ridge, more tests awaited, and the Marines, steady, methodical, unyielding, were only beginning to impose their ethos on the battlefield. The Japanese infantry, steeped in a tradition of shock and decisive assault, sought to shatter American morale with charges designed to overwhelm through sheer audacity. They advanced across the dense undergrowth, bayonets fixed, voices raised in battle cries meant to unnerve and intimidate. For decades, such tactics had succeeded in China and Southeast Asia, and commanders expected the same result here. They believed fear could precede fire, that spirit could substitute for superior firepower. Yet the Marines met each charge not with panic, but with a disciplined storm of layered automatic fire. Riflemen, bar teams, and machine gunners created fields of fire that intersected with lethal precision. Each volley did not merely stop the attackers. It reshaped the battlefield, forcing the Japanese to adapt mid-stride or collapse entirely. Where enemy doctrine relied on psychological pressure, the Americans relied on preparation, positioning, and relentless execution. Their calmness under assault began to erode expectations built over years of previous victories. Night, once Japan's domain, offered little advantage. Marine patrols moved silently through the shadows, trained for darkness, each man aware of angles, approaches, and likely enemy positions. The glow of a distant flare or the flash of a muzzle revealed targets that had assumed concealment would grant surprise. Handheld radios amplified the effect, allowing squads to coordinate movements and fire across terrain that would have confounded any less disciplined force. Where Japanese units had once dictated the rhythm of engagement under cover of darkness, the Marines imposed their own tempo. An invisible hand guiding precision strikes across the blackened landscape. Ambushes, obstacles, and prepared kill zones, the tools of Japanese ingenuity, were met with counter-ambush drills learned and refined in pre-war service. Every trap was anticipated, every chokepoint approached with methodology rather than recklessness. Observers noted a chilling efficiency. The Marines learned from each encounter in real time, adjusting formations and fire patterns with an instinctive understanding of combined arms and small unit coordination. Both sides were quick studies, but the gap in adaptation became evident. Where Japan relied on doctrine honed over decades, the Americans operated as a system, an integrated whole in which each man, weapon, and maneuver was part of a broader pattern. The Empire began to understand the unsettling truth. These Marines were not merely opponents to be beaten or intimidated. They were a living, functioning system, engineered to endure, to adapt, and to dominate the environment in which they fought. And as dawn approached over the bloodied island soil, it became clear that this clash of doctrines was not merely a contest of courage or strength. It was a confrontation between two philosophies of war, one rigid and tested, the other disciplined, flexible, and unyielding. The first major test of American resolve unfolded along the Tenaru and Matanikau rivers, where the dense jungle and treacherous swamps became the stage for a confrontation that would rewrite assumptions about combat in the Pacific. For weeks, the Japanese had moved with confidence, expecting to encounter the hesitant, disorganized opposition their doctrine predicted. They believed that well-timed charges and relentless night attacks would break the thin line of American defenders. Night after night, Japanese units surged across the mud and undergrowth, their bayonets glinting under the flickering light of flares and the rare moonbeam. They struck with the ferocity of men convinced of inevitable victory, their shouts intended to shake the Marines' courage. Yet every assault met the cold, disciplined response of a force unshaken by expectation. Overlapping fields of fire, prearranged in meticulous planning, met each wave. Riflemen, bar teams, and machine gun crews worked in concert, their combined fire turning the tide of individual courage against the certainty of massed assault. Machine guns, M1917s and M1919s, became instruments of both destruction and revelation. Japanese doctrine, built over decades of close combat, had never accounted for a defensive array so dense and coordinated. Where they had anticipated quick penetration and the collapse of morale, they found gaps in their lines carved by sustained fire, their formations shredded under the methodical, relentless rhythm of American weaponry. Each burst was precise, each firing position calculated, and each volley reinforced a lesson the Empire would struggle to unlearn. Raw courage alone could not overcome a system trained to respond, adapt, and endure. The Marines endured hardships that might have broken lesser troops. Hunger gnawed at their strength, disease thinned their ranks, and isolation from resupply created a tension that weighed as heavily as any rifle. Yet they did not retreat. They did not flinch. They held ground with a quiet tenacity that spoke not of heroism, but of preparation, discipline, and shared purpose. Every advance, every suppressed enemy movement, was proof that these were men trained not only to fight, but to survive where others would crumble. Japanese survivors later reported shock that defied the conventions they had relied upon. They spoke of soldiers who fought with the same intensity day after day, night after night, who seemed to operate without the fear, hesitation, or fatigue that had historically defined Western troops. The psychological impact was profound. Their own doctrine, once a map of assured victory, now appeared inadequate, unable to predict or control the outcome. Guadalcanal, a remote island that might have been a stepping stone to broader conquest, became instead a crucible where the Empire first confronted the limits of its assumptions. Morale, the linchpin of the Japanese approach, began to fracture. Reports trickled back to headquarters noting the tenacity and coordination of the Americans, the unyielding discipline under fire, and the uncanny integration of weapons and men into a functioning whole. The phrase, "they do not break," began to circulate quietly, a warning whispered between officers and soldiers alike. Guadalcanal was no longer merely a tactical objective. It was the first theater in which Japanese confidence, nurtured over years of victories across Asia, began to crack beneath the weight of a disciplined, adaptive opponent. And as dawn broke over the rivers, the mud, and the bloody jungle paths, both sides paused in the silence between volleys. The Marines prepared for the next wave with the same measured resolve, while the Empire confronted a hard truth. They had met a force that was more than a collection of men. They had encountered a system, disciplined and unrelenting, capable of enduring both the night and the storm. The jungle of Guadalcanal became both battlefield and teacher. The Marines, confronted with terrain thick with vines, mud, and hidden ravines, refined their tactics through a relentless regimen of trial and error. Each patrol revealed new hazards, camouflaged positions, sudden ravines, and sniper nests that had gone unnoticed in maps and reconnaissance. Lessons were learned quickly, sometimes at terrible cost, as men fell to the unseen and the unexpected. Yet with every failure came an adjustment, each mistake cataloged, analyzed, and transformed into procedure. Patience became a weapon. Small squads learned to stalk Japanese positions silently, moving through the dense undergrowth with measured steps and controlled breathing. Every movement was deliberate, every pause considered. Marines observed patterns in enemy behavior, timing patrol rotations, and learning when to press and when to hold. Night, once the domain of Japanese advantage, was now an extension of American adaptability. Darkness no longer hid danger. It became a tool of opportunity, allowing Marines to close in with precision rather than desperation. Flamethrower and demolition teams emerged as indispensable assets. They moved ahead of the main line, rooting out defenders entrenched in bunkers, caves, and reinforced positions that conventional assault could not overcome. The hiss of flame and the crack of explosives shattered the illusion of safety, forcing hidden troops into exposure or surrender. These tools, combined with disciplined rifle fire and supporting automatic weapons, allowed the Marines to maintain the initiative even in the most hostile terrain. Japanese observers, often recording these encounters in hurried diaries, noted the Americans' mastery of combined arms in miniature. Riflemen, bar gunners, mortars, and scouts worked as a cohesive unit, each element anticipating the other. Suppressive fire, reconnaissance, and maneuver were integrated at the squad and platoon level, creating a system of war that seemed greater than the sum of its parts. The Empire had never encountered an opponent so capable of blending individual initiative with rigid cohesion. Medical and logistical innovations quietly amplified this advantage. Casualty evacuation, once chaotic and slow under fire, became streamlined. Wounded Marines were rapidly removed from the line and replaced with fresh troops, allowing units to maintain strength far longer than their Japanese counterparts. Every improvement, no matter how small, reinforced endurance, resilience, and morale, creating a cumulative effect on the battlefield that the enemy could neither anticipate nor easily counter. Japanese diaries reflect a mixture of respect and unease. One officer wrote simply, "They fight like hunters." The metaphor was telling. Americans did not merely advance. They tracked, observed, and struck with patience and precision. The Marines' willingness to innovate in the face of danger, to blend tools, tactics, and timing, became a quiet but decisive advantage. Their adaptations, invisible to those expecting conventional combat, reshaped the conflict in microcosm, allowing a relatively small force to dominate terrain far larger than their numbers would suggest. By the end of each engagement, the lesson was clear. Guadalcanal had become a laboratory of war, and the Marines were its practitioners. Adaptation, discipline, and innovation were no longer abstract qualities. They were weapons as effective as any rifle or mortar. For the Japanese, the realization slowly took hold. These men were not only surviving the storm of jungle combat, they were mastering it, turning every challenge into an opportunity, every encounter into evidence of an enemy unlike any they had faced before. And as the undergrowth settled after another firefight, the Marines paused only briefly. New patrols moved forward, flamethrowers and scouts ready, applying the lessons of yesterday to the battles yet to come. Innovation, quiet and relentless, had become their most potent weapon. As the war spread across the Pacific, the Marines evolved from competent infantry into a force meticulously engineered for amphibious warfare. Divisions were organized not only for attack, but for seamless integration of land, sea, and air, a system in which every man, weapon, and vehicle served the broader rhythm of assault. Each landing became a demonstration of preparation and coordination, the result of years of doctrine refined through trial, combat, and relentless training. Japanese defenders quickly discovered that no beach could be approached without enduring a preliminary storm of naval gunfire. Cruisers, destroyers, and battleships opened fire in sustained barrages, shaping the terrain before the first Marine set foot on sand or coral. Where previous invasions might have allowed defenders to hold their positions against uncoordinated assaults, these preparatory strikes softened obstacles, disrupted fortifications, and created corridors of opportunity that only disciplined attackers could exploit. The Empire had never faced a force so thorough, so precise, and so unflinching in its opening moves. Amphibious tractors, armored and resilient, carried troops through the surf even as shells struck around them. Men disembarked under fire, advancing with rifles ready and eyes trained on the enemy. The combination of mobility, protection, and coordination gave the Marines a foothold that would have been impossible for earlier forces, allowing them to establish positions under conditions that might have destroyed less prepared units. Each successful landing reinforced the principle that preparation, technology, and doctrine could converge to overcome numerical or positional disadvantage. Small unit cohesion became the silent backbone of every operation. Squads trained to operate independently within the larger assault executed maneuvers that mirrored the intent of the entire division. Leaders at the platoon and squad levels made rapid decisions in complex terrain, improvising within doctrine while maintaining cohesion. Even when disrupted by terrain, enemy fire, or logistical delay, these units functioned almost as autonomous engines of war, advancing, suppressing, and adapting with remarkable efficiency. Marine aviation layered yet another element onto this integrated assault. LT, dive bombers, fighters, and close air support coordinated with forward observers on the ground, delivering precision strikes that shattered previously unassailable defenses. The Japanese, accustomed to predicting the tempo of infantry movements, were confronted with an opponent whose reach extended vertically as well as horizontally. Defensive positions that had once relied on concealment and massed fire were exposed to a multi-dimensional force operating with unprecedented synchronization. Reports filtered back to Japanese commanders describing men who fought through exhaustion, hunger, and stress with unshakable tactical clarity. The audacity of the Americans, combined with their discipline and adaptability, confounded expectations. Units that should have faltered instead pressed forward, leveraging combined arms, reconnaissance, and small unit initiative to maintain momentum even under the heaviest fire. The result was the emergence of the Marine machine, a force whose efficiency and precision became a symbol of fear among the defenders. It was not simply the men, nor the weapons, nor the vehicles. It was the system itself, coordinated, adaptive, and unyielding. Beaches, ridges, and jungle passes were overcome not through luck, but through the integration of doctrine, training, and innovation. To the Japanese, it was a force that fought like a single organism, relentless in its advance, unbroken by fatigue, and terrifying in its predictability of success. And yet, as another island's shore came into view on the horizon, the Marines prepared to land once more, armored tractors ready, artillery calibrated, and squads poised to operate in harmony. The machine had learned from every encounter, every obstacle, every ambush, and it would carry those lessons forward into the battles yet to come. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, surveyed the coral atoll with quiet certainty. "They cannot take Tarawa in 100 years, he promised his superiors, the words carrying the weight of decades of defensive doctrine and the confidence of men who believed in the unassailability of fortified islands. His men, entrenched in bunkers, pillboxes, and reinforced emplacements, had spent months preparing for the inevitable assault. Every sandbar, every reef, every patch of coral had been surveyed, mined, and defended with painstaking attention. In his mind, the Americans approaching the lagoon were destined to falter before even reaching the shore. But the Marines did not falter. The assault began under conditions that would have broken any conventional force. Tides misjudged, waves lapped higher than anticipated, and landing craft ground to a halt on submerged reefs. Men waded through waist and chest-deep water, their packs heavy with ammunition, rifles, and flamethrowers. Bullets struck the surf around them, cutting swathes through the advancing lines. Despite the chaos, the squads pressed forward, exploiting every dip in terrain, every slight shadow for cover. Forward momentum, discipline, and training held them together as the sea itself threatened to stall the attack. Japanese defenders watched in disbelief as Americans crawled through the surf under direct machine gun fire, each man moving with an almost mechanical determination. The enemy had anticipated hesitation, fear, and the instinct to seek cover, yet these Marines seemed immune to instinct itself, advancing methodically despite the devastation surrounding them. The combination of small unit initiative, suppressive fire, and sheer determination allowed them to close distances that had been calculated as impassable. Each step toward the fortified positions was a lesson in the cost of underestimating an opponent engineered for both endurance and aggression. Pillboxes fell not to luck, but to preparation and audacity. Explosives were planted at point-blank range. Flamethrowers spat fire into bunkers, forcing defenders to retreat or perish. Marines moved in deliberate waves, supporting one another as teams cleared each fortification in turn. The sound of hissing flames, detonating charges, and the disciplined rhythm of rifle fire became the soundtrack of a siege that defied expectation. Where the defenders anticipated terror and retreat, they encountered methodical, relentless aggression. Astonishment ran through the Japanese ranks. Survivors reported men who continued to fight despite wounds that would have ended others' participation. Each casualty was replaced, each position reinforced, yet the momentum never slowed. Tactical clarity, coordination, and sheer endurance combined to create a force that moved with the inevitability of a machine while retaining the cunning of a predator. Tarawa, once considered an impregnable stronghold, became a proving ground for the ethos of the Marine Corps. By the end of the first day, the Empire confronted an uncomfortable truth. Shibasaki's promises, the doctrine of impregnable fortifications, and the years of defensive preparation were insufficient against a force trained to integrate firepower, initiative, and resilience at every level. The Marines did not merely assault the island. They imposed a system of war that the defenders had never encountered, one in which adaptation, coordination, and endurance outweighed entrenched certainty. Tarawa entered the record books not just as a tactical engagement, but as the moment Japan fully understood what the Marine Corps represented. Discipline hardened into machine-like precision. Small unit initiative became a force multiplier. Each landing, each breach, each advance etched a warning into the memory of the Empire. These men would not falter, would not retreat, and could endure what others could not imagine. And as the sun sank over the shattered reefs and smoking pillboxes, the Marines paused only briefly, already preparing for the next objective. In their wake, Tarawa remained, a name burned into memory, a warning written in blood and courage, and the first unmistakable signal that the Marine Corps had arrived as a force that would redefine warfare in the Pacific. The beaches of Saipan were alive with fire long before the first Marine boots touched the sand. Officers, observing the initial waves from landing craft, feared the worst. Intelligence predicted heavy resistance, but the reality surpassed even the most pessimistic estimates. Machine guns tore the surf to ribbons, artillery cut arcs of death across the coastline, and mortars rained destruction into every shallow channel. Some commanders whispered that as many as 50% of the first assaulting force would fall before reaching the inland defenses. Yet, the Marines pressed forward, each man conditioned to act with discipline under conditions that would have shattered any lesser formation. Japanese forces, convinced that sheer mass could still break an enemy, launched counterattacks of unprecedented scale. Thousands surged forward in tightly packed formations, relying on shock and morale to carry them through the hail of bullets and shells. The defenders had honed the banzai charge into both ritual and weapon, a culmination of doctrine that had succeeded countless times before. But against the Marines of Saipan, the calculation failed. The Americans had learned from every island, every reef, every embattled shoreline. Their response was immediate, coordinated, and devastating. Artillery, tanks, and naval gunfire were synchronized with an efficiency that astonished observers. Spotters in the hills, on ships, and embedded within infantry units relayed corrections with a precision that made the battlefield a controlled system of destruction. When Japanese forces pressed, they were met not by piecemeal defense, but by the combined might of an integrated force. Waves of attackers were shredded before they could reach the first line of Marines, each volley reinforcing the harsh lesson that traditional mass assault was no longer a viable strategy against this opponent. Dismounted Marines moved inland with methodical precision through cane fields and the labyrinth of volcanic caves. Each squad acted as both scout and suppressive element, maintaining formations that allowed fire to cover movement while minimizing exposure. Terrain that should have favored defenders, the thick cane, uneven ridges, and hidden caves, was neutralized by training and coordination. Marines communicated through radios, hand signals, and prearranged patterns, closing gaps that might have been exploited in earlier wars. The largest banzai charge of the Pacific War came next. Tens of thousands of Japanese troops surged forward in a desperate gamble, hoping to pierce the American line through sheer determination. They met immovable firepower instead. Bar gunners, machine gun crews, and rifle squads combined into lethal intersections of fire. Artillery rounds landed precisely in the ranks, naval gunfire carved corridors of destruction, and tanks annihilated the unshielded. Within hours, the charge collapsed completely, leaving devastation and silence where a force had once believed victory certain. Japanese commanders, forced to observe from forward positions and scattered posts, witnessed the annihilation of an entire division. Doctrine, morale, and strategy, everything that had once dictated battlefield success, had failed in the face of disciplined, integrated, and adaptive American forces. Confidence, once absolute, fractured in real time, as officers realized that the war they had trained to fight no longer existed in the form they had expected. Saipan fell not simply as a tactical victory, but as a strategic watershed. The perimeter of Japanese defense in the Central Pacific began to collapse. The myth of invincibility, reinforced by decades of victories, was shattered. In its place stood a new reality, a Marine Corps capable of absorbing fire, adapting, coordinating, and annihilating even the most determined counterattack. The Empire learned that its traditional doctrines, mass assault, reliance on morale, and shock tactics, could no longer hold against a force engineered for endurance, precision, and relentless advance. As the smoke lifted over the bloodied beaches and shattered cane fields, Marines prepared to press onward, their momentum unbroken, their system intact. Saipan was more than a victory. It was a warning, a confirmation of what the Marine Corps represented. A machine of discipline, coordination, and inexorable power that would define the next phase of the Pacific War. Iwo Jima rose from the Pacific like a blackened sentinel, its volcanic slopes carved into a fortress designed to kill every invader. Concrete bunkers, interconnected tunnels, and concealed artillery positions transformed the island into a labyrinth of lethal intent. Every ridge, every crater, every scarred slope was a deliberate obstacle, engineered to funnel attackers into zones of concentrated fire. Japanese planners believed that any landing force would be exhausted and broken before reaching the heart of the defenses. Yet the Marines advanced with silent resolve, step by step, through interlocking fields of fire that would have crushed less disciplined troops. Riflemen, bar gunners, and machine gun teams moved in concert, each aware of the protective fire offered by comrades and the lethal reach of supporting units. Movement was deliberate, rehearsed, and adaptive, exploiting every fold of terrain, every shadow, every crest that offered momentary concealment. They did not hesitate. They did not pause to mourn the fallen. Progress was measured not in fear or fatigue, but in yards gained and positions seized. Japanese defenders watched in disbelief as the Americans dug in immediately after every advance. Each foothold gained was fortified, fields of fire recalculated, and observation posts manned with relentless attention. Entrenchment was instantaneous, transforming small gains into strongholds capable of absorbing counterattacks. It was a rhythm of action and reaction, a cycle that eroded the defenders' expectation that the enemy would tire, hesitate, or falter under constant fire. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads became indispensable tools in the assault. Underground tunnel networks, previously assumed impregnable, were reduced to rubble as fire and explosives forced defenders into exposure or submission. Each breach was precise and methodical, a blend of training and courage that left Japanese officers reassessing every assumption about American tactics. Where doctrine had emphasized avoidance of prepared positions or reliance on artillery, the Marines turned doctrine into execution, integrating weapons, men, and terrain into a system of relentless pressure. Casualties mounted with every advance. Blood and smoke stained the volcanic sand, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the ridges and tunnels. Yet discipline never fractured. Even amid devastation, squads maintained formation, leaders made rapid tactical decisions, and firepower was applied with meticulous coordination. Fear and exhaustion were present, but they did not dictate action. Training and ethos carried each Marine forward. Japanese officers, recording what they could in journals and field notes, noted the uncanny composure of their adversaries. "They fight as if already resigned to death," one wrote, capturing a phenomenon that combined courage, calculation, and the inexorable acceptance of sacrifice. It was a level of resolve that transcended individual bravery. It was institutional, systemic, and terrifying in its predictability. Iwo Jima solidified the Marines' reputation as a force capable of taking any objective, regardless of cost. Every bunker reduced, every tunnel neutralized, every ridge seized was a testament not to chance, but to preparation, discipline, and integration of tactics. Across the volcanic island, the pattern became unmistakable. These were not men who simply reacted to fire. They imposed a system of war, one in which adaptation, coordination, and sheer will fused into a machine that could endure, absorb, and advance under conditions that had once seemed impossible. And as the blackened slopes smoldered with spent ordnance and shattered positions, the Marines paused only briefly. New objectives loomed beyond the ridges, and the lessons learned in fire, smoke, and cratered ground would carry forward. Iwo Jima was not merely a battle. It was the moment the Marine Corps was defined, a demonstration to the Empire that no fortress, no doctrine, and no fear could halt a force engineered to persist and prevail. Reports began to circulate with increasing frequency, the kind that commanders had long avoided. The Marines were not just soldiers. They were the most formidable American formation the Empire had ever faced. Accounts came from survivors, from scouts and officers who had endured direct contact, and from forward observers who had watched lines of men advance with precision that seemed unnatural. Every story shared the same pattern: unbroken squads moving under fire, coordinated, adaptive, and relentless. Survivors described the fear that gripped them at the first sign of a Marine squad advancing. The movement was slow, deliberate, and synchronized, each man in step with the others, each rifle, bar, and machine gun working in harmony. To those on the receiving end, it was as though they were hearing not men, but a force with weight and intent, methodically closing the distance with inexorable pressure. Where previous American units had been assumed hesitant or pliable, these troops projected inevitability, an unstoppable presence that compressed space and shattered expectation. Naval gunfire, coordinated with ground advances, compounded the effect. Offshore, cruisers and destroyers executed barrages with uncanny timing, supporting every maneuver of the infantry with fire that struck with both precision and psychological impact. What had once been considered the singular advantage of entrenched defenders, the combination of prepared positions and morale, was neutralized by integration and foresight. The Marines made firepower, coordination, and endurance indistinguishable from methodical strategy, leaving the defenders scrambling to react to a force that refused to be shaken or broken. Japanese doctrine, long rooted in assumptions about morale, shock tactics, and the limits of human endurance, began to fracture under the weight of experience. Traditional beliefs that Western troops would falter under concentrated pressure, that moral fortitude could substitute for training, that spiritual preparation would outmatch bullets and explosives, were confronted by the stark evidence of battlefield reality. Commanders who had relied upon these precepts were forced to acknowledge a simple truth. These Marines could endure, adapt, and press relentlessly where others would retreat. Even the myth of spiritual superiority, once considered the cornerstone of imperial confidence, faltered beneath the weight of observation. Officers quietly recorded instances in which Marines advanced through hailstorms. Dawn broke over the Pacific in April of 1944 with a stillness that felt almost deliberate. The water, pale and unbroken, stretched to the horizon, and yet beneath that placid surface, an unseen American hunter moved with purpose. No smoke trailed behind it, no shadow marked its presence. To the Japanese sailors, the morning seemed ordinary, but in truth, the ordinary had already abandoned.